The German pilot thought the American had made a mistake. High above the bomber stream, a P-51 Mustang suddenly rolled upside down in the middle of a climb, something every fighter manual warned pilots never to do in combat. The maneuver bled speed, sacrificed lift, and exposed the vulnerable belly of the aircraft to enemy fire. Any experienced pilot knew better. Yet the Mustang did it anyway. For a brief moment, the aircraft hung inverted in the thin, freezing air over Germany. Then, instead of leveling out or completing a loop, the American fighter rolled through the bottom of an impossible arc and dropped into a descending turn that cut sharply across the German fighter's expected flight path. The geometry of the fight suddenly stopped making sense. The German pilot adjusted his climb, expecting the Mustang to follow a predictable loop or dive. Instead, the American fighter reappeared inside his turn, closing distance far faster than physics seemed to allow. 2 seconds later, heavy .50 caliber machine guns erupted from the Mustang's wings. By the time the German realized what had happened, his wingman was already spiraling toward the ground, trailing smoke. The maneuver had no official name. Not yet. But within a few years, variations of it would be taught to fighter pilots across the world. And the man who first used it in combat had arrived at the idea not through instinct, but through mathematics. The air war over Europe in 1943 was governed by brutal arithmetic. American bombers flew deep into German territory every day, targeting factories, rail yards, and oil refineries that fueled the Nazi war machine. The missions were long, often 8 hours or more, and the bombers flew at altitudes above 23,000 feet, where the air was thin and the temperature far below freezing. At those heights, oxygen masks froze to faces and gun turrets filled with ice. And waiting above the bomber formations were German fighters. The Luftwaffe had learned quickly how to exploit the weaknesses of American bomber tactics. Their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s attacked from higher altitude, diving through the formations at tremendous speed. They fired their cannons in a single devastating pass, then climbed away before escort fighters could intercept them. It was a brutal system. The bombers bled aircraft daily. American escort fighters tried to protect them, but the math often favored the defenders. The German pilot chose when to attack. The American pilot reacted. And in air combat, the pilot who reacts is already behind. The rules governing fighter combat were strict. Speed was life. Altitude was life insurance. Every maneuver cost energy, and energy meant survival. Training manuals drilled these principles into young pilots. Never sacrifice altitude for angle. Never bleed speed in a tight turn. Never invert during combat. Those rules existed for good reason. They had been written in the blood of pilots who had tried something different and died. Yet by 1943, the Germans had adapted their tactics. They avoided turning fights entirely. Instead, they used high-speed slashing attacks, diving through bomber formations, and escaping vertically before American escorts could respond. The Mustang was an agile fighter, capable of tight turns and excellent range. But agility required time. And time was something the Germans rarely allowed. At Debden Airfield in Essex, England, the war felt far less dramatic than it did in the skies above Europe. The airfield was muddy most of the year. Rain pooled around parked aircraft. Ground crews worked constantly to keep engines running and wings patched after combat damage. Pilots gathered each morning inside small briefing huts. The meetings were practical and emotionless. Weather, fuel, altitude, expected enemy contact. No one talked about heroics. The numbers alone told the story. Few pilots survived more than 20 missions. Among the men of the 361st Fighter Group, one pilot began attracting quiet attention. Not because he bragged, because he didn't. His name was Urban Leonard Drew, though most people simply called him Ben. He rarely spoke during briefings. He did not tell dramatic combat stories. Yet his mission reports were unusual. He often returned with more fuel remaining than other pilots. Less ammunition spent. And sometimes enemy aircraft destroyed under circumstances no one else had witnessed clearly. His kills were frequently listed as probable. They happened too quickly, too far from the bomber formation, too unexpectedly for other pilots to confirm. Some admired him. Others distrusted what they didn't understand. The operations officer once asked Drew how he managed it. Drew shrugged and said he got lucky. But luck rarely repeated itself so consistently. Before the war, Drew had studied engineering. He had spent 2 years calculating tolerances and mechanical loads before the conflict interrupted his education. To him, an aircraft was not a symbol of heroism. It was a system. Lift, drag, thrust, weight. Every maneuver was simply a balance of forces. He knew the stall speed of the P-51 Mustang at different bank angles and fuel loads. He knew how much rudder input corrected adverse yaw during slow rolls. He knew how the aircraft behaved at the very edge of aerodynamic control. Most fighter pilots relied on instinct. Drew relied on numbers. At Debden, he often carried a small notebook. Inside were sketches of flight paths, curved lines, angles, speeds scribbled in the margins. Other pilots teased him. They called him the professor. The nickname wasn't meant cruelly, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. During training in the United States, Drew had become fascinated with the limits of flight. Instructors taught pilots to respect those limits, to avoid them entirely. But Drew approached them carefully. Curiously, he practiced high-speed rolls, inverted passes, and hammerhead stalls during training flights when instructors weren't watching closely. Not reckless experimentation, controlled exploration. He wanted to know exactly where the edge of control existed. Engineering had taught him something important. Limits were not walls. They were thresholds, and if you understood them precisely, you could touch them without crossing them. In early 1944, Drew flew his first combat missions over Europe. Combat was faster than training, colder, more chaotic. Tracer rounds flashed past like streaks of red lightning. Radio transmissions overlapped in confused bursts, and decisions had to be made in fractions of a second. But Drew did not panic. He calculated. After his 5th mission, he wrote a letter home to his brother. He did not describe fear. Instead, he wrote about angles. He explained that German pilots were extremely skilled, but predictable. They relied on altitude and speed. They attacked from above, then climbed away again. What they did not expect, Drew wrote, was a fighter that could reverse direction without following the normal geometry of a loop or dive. The letter never mentioned victories, only possibilities. The real problem facing American escort fighters was not courage. It was geometry. German fighters controlled the start of every engagement. They attacked from above. American pilots climbed to intercept them. But climbing drained speed. By the time the Mustang reached the German altitude, the enemy had already fired and escaped. Some American pilots tried to outturn the Germans, but experienced Luftwaffe pilots refused turning fights. Others tried to dive after them. But the heavier Focke-Wulf 190 could often dive faster. Every encounter followed the same pattern. Attack, escape, repeat. Drew began wondering if the problem wasn't the aircraft, but the axis of the fight itself. And if the axis changed, the outcome might change too. In his notebook, he began sketching something unusual. Not a loop, not a split S, something between them. A rolling reversal performed at high speed during a zoom climb. A maneuver that inverted the aircraft briefly before dropping into a descending turn that cut sharply across an enemy's expected flight path. The manuals called inversion dangerous. Suicidal, even. But Drew's calculations suggested something different. If the maneuver was performed above a certain speed, if the roll was smooth, if the pilot controlled the descent angle carefully, then the aircraft would keep enough energy to complete the turn faster than any conventional maneuver. The math said it might work. The manuals said it would get him killed. Drew suspected both might be true. The bomber stream stretched across the sky like a slow-moving steel river. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses droned eastward toward Germany, their formation so large it seemed to fill the horizon. From a distance, the aircraft looked almost peaceful, sunlight glinting off polished aluminum wings. But everyone in the sky knew what would happen soon. German fighters were coming. They always did. High above the bombers, Drew's flight of P-51 Mustangs orbited at nearly 26,000 feet. The altitude was brutal. The air outside the cockpit was colder than -40 degrees. Even inside the aircraft, the cold crept slowly through gloves and boots. Frost formed along the edges of the canopy. The world up there was strangely quiet. Just the steady roar of the Merlin engine, and the occasional crackle of the radio. Then a voice cut through the static. Bandits. 3 o'clock high. Drew turned his head. 2 dark shapes appeared above the formation. Focke-Wulf 190s. They were already diving. The attack unfolded exactly as the Luftwaffe manuals described. The German fighters dropped steeply through the bomber formation, engines screaming as gravity accelerated them. Their cannons fired in short, devastating bursts. Heavy shells tore through one of the bombers. Almost instantly, the aircraft began trailing smoke. The German fighters pulled out of the dive and began climbing away. It was fast, efficient, and almost impossible to stop. Drew and his wingmen turned toward the attackers, but the German fighters already had the advantage. They were climbing again, using the speed from their dive to escape back to safety. Standard procedure. Every German pilot knew the Americans could not catch them. Not in time. Drew pushed the throttle forward. War emergency power. The Merlin engine roared louder as the Mustang surged forward. The aircraft accelerated rapidly. Then Drew pulled back on the stick and pitched upward into a zoom climb. The Mustang shot upward toward the retreating German fighters. Speed bled away as altitude increased. But Drew kept climbing. The German pilots noticed. They continued climbing as well. They knew the American fighter could not reach them. Eventually, the Mustang would run out of speed and stall. Then it would drop away. Another American pilot defeated by gravity. But Drew had no intention of stalling. As his airspeed dropped toward 160 miles per hour, he reached the top of the climb. For a brief moment, the aircraft seemed to hover in the sky. Then Drew moved the control stick. The Mustang rolled upside down. Inversion was one of the things pilots were taught never to do in combat. It sacrificed lift. It exposed the vulnerable underside of the aircraft. But Drew did not hesitate. He held the aircraft inverted for a fraction of a second. Then gravity began pulling the nose downward through the horizon. The aircraft dropped into a descending arc. But it was not a loop. And not a dive. The German pilot watched the maneuver unfold. To him, it looked wrong. The Mustang should have completed a loop or a split S. Instead, the American fighter was sliding through a strange curved path. Something between a roll and a dive. Something unfamiliar. He adjusted his climb to avoid where he believed the Mustang would appear. But Drew was not following the expected path. Halfway through the descent, Drew rolled the Mustang upright again. Then he pulled hard into a tight, high-G turn. Suddenly, the American fighter appeared inside the German aircraft's turn radius. The geometry of the fight had changed completely. The German pilot tried to break away. Too late. Drew pressed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted from the Mustang's wings. The firing lasted only 2 seconds. But it was enough. Bullets tore through the wing root and fuselage of the Focke-Wulf. The German aircraft shuddered violently. Pieces of metal ripped away. Moments later, the fighter spiraled downward, trailing smoke and fire. Drew immediately scanned the sky. The second German pilot had already turned away. He was leaving the fight. Drew did not pursue him. The mission was to protect the bombers, not chase individual victories. He pushed the Mustang back into a climb and returned to his escort position above the formation. His wingman's voice exploded over the radio. What the hell was that? Drew didn't answer. He didn't have a name for the maneuver. He wasn't even sure how to describe it. All he knew was that it had worked. Back at Debden Airfield, the debriefing room felt unusually quiet. Drew reported the kill. The operations officer studied him carefully. Explain exactly what you did. Drew tried. He described the roll. The inverted transition. The way the maneuver preserved energy while changing the angle of the fight. He talked about lift vectors. About how the roll allowed the aircraft to reverse direction faster than a traditional loop. The officer listened patiently. Then he shook his head. Don't do it again. It wasn't in the manual. And if other pilots attempted it without understanding the mechanics, they would kill themselves. Drew nodded. He understood the concern. But he also knew something else. The maneuver had solved the geometry problem. That evening, 2 other pilots approached him in the officers' club. They had seen the fight from a distance. They wanted to know if the maneuver could be repeated, if it could be taught. Drew thought about it. I don't know, he admitted. I've only done it once in combat. Then he added quietly. But the math works. If the speed stayed above 150 miles per hour. If the roll was smooth. If the pilot understood exactly where the aircraft's lift vector pointed during the maneuver. Then it should work again. Should. The word hung in the air between them. 3 weeks later, Drew was back over Germany. This mission was larger. More bombers. More escort fighters. And far more German interceptors. The Luftwaffe had thrown nearly everything into the sky. Focke-Wulfs, Messerschmitt 109s, even inexperienced replacement pilots flying outdated aircraft. The sky quickly filled with twisting aircraft and flashing gunfire. Drew broke right, climbed, reached the top of the climb, and rolled inverted again. This time the maneuver felt smoother, more controlled. He knew the rhythm now. The Mustang seemed almost designed for it. One German pilot tried to follow him through the roll. Halfway through the maneuver, the German aircraft stalled. Its nose snapped downward violently. The fighter flipped into a spin. Drew never fired. The aircraft was already doomed. Another American pilot saw the maneuver. A young lieutenant named Vickers attempted it during the next engagement. But he rolled too slowly. The aircraft lost too much speed. The nose dropped sharply. He pulled nearly 7 gs trying to recover. His vision turned gray. He blacked out for a moment. When he came to, he was nearly 1,000 feet lower, disoriented and alone. He survived. Barely. Back on the ground, he told Drew the maneuver was insane. Drew agreed. But insane did not mean impossible. Word began spreading through the squadron. Some pilots were fascinated. Others were furious. One captain argued loudly in the ready room that Drew was going to get someone killed. Tricks didn't win wars, he said. Discipline and formation tactics did. Drew didn't argue. Instead, he asked a single question. How many bombers did your formation lose last week? The captain didn't answer. Soon the maneuver would spread beyond Drew's squadron. And within months, pilots across Europe would be experimenting with it. Some would succeed. Some would crash trying. But the geometry of the air war was already beginning to change. Drew eventually flew 69 combat missions over Europe. Official records credited him with 6 confirmed aerial victories, though many pilots believe the number might have been higher. Air combat was chaotic, and not every enemy aircraft that went down could be verified. What mattered most was that Drew survived. When the war ended, he did what many combat pilots struggled to do. He simply went home. Back in the United States, Drew returned to engineering. Instead of designing fighter tactics or combat aircraft, he worked on small civilian airplanes and crop dusters. Practical machines built for farms and rural airfields. Nothing glamorous, nothing famous. And Drew rarely spoke about the maneuver that had quietly changed the way fighter pilots fought. When people asked him about it, he usually shrugged. He said he had been lucky. He said the P-51 Mustang was a good airplane. He said German pilots sometimes made mistakes. But anyone who studied his old flight logs saw something different. In the margins were small diagrams. Angles. Speeds written with careful precision. Drew had not been lucky. He had been calculating. Decades later, at a fighter pilot reunion in Nevada, someone asked Drew to explain the maneuver again. By then he was nearly 70 years old. His hands trembled slightly with age, but when he began speaking his voice remained calm and steady. He walked to a chalkboard and drew the same curved arcs he had once sketched in a cold briefing hut in England. He talked about lift vectors, roll rates, and energy management. Young pilots listened closely. Many of them now flew F-16s and F-18s, aircraft far faster and more powerful than the old Mustang. But the geometry Drew described had not changed. Physics never had. One pilot finally asked him the question everyone wondered about. Were you afraid the first time you tried it in combat? Drew thought for a moment. Then he nodded. Yes. But fear wasn't the real problem. The real problem was certainty. He was certain the math worked. What he wasn't certain about was whether he could execute it perfectly in the middle of a dogfight. And certainty without execution, he explained, was only theory. So he tried it. The airplane held together. The German fighter didn't. The maneuver eventually became part of fighter pilot training. Not always under Drew's name. Not always exactly as he had first flown it. But the principle survived. Every time a fighter pilot rolls inverted at the top of a climb and transitions into a diving attack, the same geometry appears again. Most pilots never know where the idea began, but they are still flying the mathematics Drew once scribbled in a notebook. Urban Leonard Drew died in 1998. His funeral was quiet. The obituary mentioned his war service, his family, and his work in aviation. It did not mention the maneuver. Most people at the service never knew the story, but a few older pilots standing in the back did. They understood something others did not. The greatest innovations in aviation are not always remembered by name. Sometimes they become so successful that they disappear into the very fabric of flight. Drew's maneuver was one of those. A small change in geometry. A different way to turn in the sky. A single pilot refusing to believe the rulebook was finished. And because of that refusal, generations of pilots would fight differently.